And today I will be presenting the study entitled Public Debt as a Determinant of Economic Growth. Here are some recent headlines regarding national debt. Last year, the national debt hit a record $22 trillion, sparking national attention. However, what is national debt and why should we care? Well, we should care now more than ever, given that the government is increasing spending for relief and borrowing upwards $3 trillion. National debt is the total amount of money a country owes its creditors. It's considered okay and necessary for economic growth as long as the proceeds are used to stimulate the growth of the economy. However, debt does have some negative effects. For example, if a country is seen as unable to pay back its debt, its economy is considered risky. Foreign investors are more likely to pull their assets from risky markets. Additionally, governments will try to offset the deficit by getting more revenue to pay it off through higher taxes. And when governments have less money to spend, that leads to higher unemployment. GDP is the gross domestic product, the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country for 1 year. The equation for measuring GDP is shown above. GDP can be used as an indicator of the economic health of a country. For example, a recession is measured in 2 periods of negative GDP growth. Growth rate is the percent increase in GDP from quarter to quarter. The GDP growth rate can often be used to compare the productivity of many countries. Figure 1 shows the historical and current policy projections for the debt held by the public as a percent of GDP. As of 2017, the debt-GDP ratio was 76%. However, the debt is projected to rise and overcome GDP around 2040. This outrageous growth could be achieved and is likely to happen sooner than predicted given the increase in government spending during this crisis. Interest on the debt is the total amount of money the government pays each year servicing the debt. And as the debt increases, so does this interest that we have to pay back every single year. Interest rate is a percentage of the principal charged by the lender for the use of this money. Interest rates vary by country depending on the risk of the country. Figure 2 is interest on the debt compared to other government expenditures in the United States. This data is gathered from the Congressional Budget Office, and given these calculations, interest on the debt will exceed many other government expenditures such as defense and Medicaid in the coming years. One of the first studies to investigate the relationship between growth and debt is Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 Growth in a Time of Debt. They had over 200 observations, and they investigated advanced and emerging economies. They found a weak relationship between debt and GDP at normal levels, which they considered to be 0.9%. However, they found a strong negative relationship above 90% debt GDP. The 90% debt GDP threshold where country growth becomes negative. Threshold is a point where once the debt GDP ratio reaches that point, there will be continuous decline in GDP growth from then on. Desai in 2016 created a multiple regression variable model for predictors of GDP growth rate in India. He included macroeconomic indicators such as inflation, manufacturing and servicing purchasing manager index, interest rates, and more. Each macroeconomic factor was studied individually. Overall, interest rates have a neutral effect on GDP growth according to Desai. Bria Gomez and Sejas in 2017 explored dynamic relationship between public debt and economic growth using a non-parametric approach. They used data summarization and clustering methods. They investigated 16 countries between 1977 and 2015. They found that 90% debt to GDP threshold drives select countries, and this threshold originates from the financial crisis of 2008. The hypothesis of this study is that there is a negative relationship between general government gross debt and GDP growth rates that operates when the ratio of general government gross debt to GDP growth rate surpasses a threshold value. Additionally, we expect there to be a negative correlation between debt interest rates and GDP growth rates. The groups of countries that were gathered for this study include developed and developing countries. This was based on the UN classification of developed and developing, which they based on fuel export, per capita gross income, and other economic factors. The inclusion criteria for the study is that data is continuous and data is available for all variables. This was in order to maximize the number of countries and years that could be included in the dataset. The data collected included real GDP growth as an annual percentage change from the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. They are an organization that publishes a range of time series data on IMF lending, exchange rates, and other economic and financial indicators online. General government gross debt as a percent of GDP, and interest payments as a percent of tax revenue. All this data is in percentages in order to avoid currency conversions. Figure 3 is a scatter plot relating debt to GDP growth for selected developed countries. The next 3 figures I will show you are for developed countries from 1992 to 2018. Based on the linear regression, there is a negative association between general government gross debt and GDP growth. Figure 4 is a bar graph relating debt to GDP growth for selected developed countries. A bar chart was created for debt to GDP growth where there are 4 debt categories: debt to GDP below 30%, 30, 60, 60 and 90, and above 90%. This methodology was based on Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 Growth in Time and Debt, but differences are that this study included continuous data, this study weighted by country year rather than by country. Since equal weighting by country gives 1-year episodes, I must weight as nearly 2 decades in the above 90% debt to GDP range. Weighting by country year is more conventional because it provides perspective for that year. This bar graph shows that no threshold could be definitively ascertained. Increased debt correlates with lower growth, suggesting a negative relationship between the 2 variables. The ANOVA supports that at different debt categories, GDP growth is significantly different with a p-value of less than 0.05. Figure 5 is a scatter plot relating interest on debt GDP growth for 31 developed countries from 1996 to 2016. A linear regression model was created based on the data. There's a weak negative relationship was found between debt to GDP and GDP growth. Figure 6 is a scatter plot relating debt to GDP growth for selected developing countries. A linear regression was graphed on the graph, and a weak positive relationship was found between debt to GDP and GDP growth. Figure 7 is a bar graph relating debt to GDP growth for selected developing countries. There was no significant difference between the bar graphs as shown by an ANOVA with p-value greater than 0.05. Figure 8 is a scatter plot relating interest on debt GDP growth for 20 developing countries from 1996 to 2016. Interest on the debt and GDP growth have a negative relationship that is steeper than found for developed economies. Also included in the study was a multiple regression model. A multiple regression model includes more than one independent variable for one dependent variable. The multiple regression model was used to see if 2 variables, debt GDP and debt interest, have a negative association with GDP growth rates. The equation used is shown above. Table 1 is a summary statistics for developed countries multiple regression model, including 28 developed countries from 1996 to 2018. Overall, there was no threshold found because the threshold predicted falls outside the range of normal data, so no threshold was found unless there be extrapolation. However, this model does give evidence of a negative relationship between debt to GDP and GDP growth rates. In Table 2 is a summary statistics for developing countries multiple regression model, including 10 developing countries from 1996 to 2018. Based on the terms, a threshold is predicted, but the threshold falls outside the range of normal data. Once again, no threshold was determined lest there be extrapolation. However, this model does provide evidence of a positive relationship between debt GDP and GDP growth rates. Overall, for developed countries, there was a negative relationship between GDP growth rates and debt GDP, and a negative relationship between GDP growth rates and interest on debt. For developing countries, with positive and a neutral relationship between GDP growth and debt GDP, and negative relationship between GDP growth and interest on the debt. Some limitations of this study is that specific data is not available, data on debt growth rates was easier to find than interest on debt, and there was a social desirability bias in which all the data was self-reported, so countries may have tampered with the statistics in order to attract investors and boost their economy. Data is oftentimes incomplete. Missing use of data resulted in exclusion of some countries from the dataset. Overall, this research is important to influence policymakers and prevent the outrageous growth that is predicted. Additionally, the impact of rising interest is not considered. but it should, given that it's consuming government funds, and this study found evidence that it is negatively affecting GDP growth for both developed and developing countries. And to bring more attention to the detriment of debt, given that debt can have negative impacts on growth for developed economies, such as the United States. Future research should investigate if the relationship, why the relationship between debt GDP and GDP growth is different, and use different statistical analysis such as time series model or moving average regression model, and include more groups of countries such as African countries or groups of countries such as the European Union. I would like to acknowledge my mentor for all his support and assistance throughout this process, and my science research teacher who has acted as a sounding board and mentor throughout this journey. These are my references. Thank you very much.